This is the story of Delta Airlines Flight 723. On the 31st of July 1973, a Delta Airlines DC-9 was flying from Burlington, Vermont to Boston. But the plane had to make an unscheduled stop at Manchester, New Hampshire because Flight 723 had to pick up people from an earlier flight that had been canceled. So the flight departed Manchester Airport's gate at 9:57 a.m. with 83 passengers and 5 crew members on board. But the plane couldn't just get off the ground yet, as the weather at Boston was not the best, and so they had to wait for a bit as the weather at Boston got better. Finally, at 10:50 a.m., the plane took off with the first officer in charge, and with the captain in charge of communications. After taking off, the plane was on the way to Boston, and the pilots were in contact with the approach control at Boston. The approach controller said, "No delays, plan vectors ILS 31. The Boston altimeter is 3011, weather is partial obscuration, estimated 400 overcast, mile and a half of fog," end quote. The weather was not the worst, but it was also not the best. I can't help but wonder if the pilots had been hoping for some better weather on their way down into Boston. As Flight 723 acknowledged, the plane climbed to its assigned altitude of 4,000 feet. Yeah, this was a short flight. And the pilots in the cockpit went through the after takeoff checklist. As soon as they were done with the after takeoff checklist, it was time for them to start their descent. The controller now let Flight 723 descend to 3,000 feet and gave them a new heading to fly. Then at 11:04 a.m., the controller asked Flight 723 to do the following. Delta 723, fly a heading of 080, now intercept the localizer course and fly it inbound, over, end quote. The controller was asking the pilots to intercept this radio beam that is sent out from the foot of the runway. The localizer beam allows the onboard computers of the plane to calculate where it is in relation to the runway, laterally. In reduced visual conditions like these, a localizer is a game changer and can quite literally save lives. In the cockpit, signs pointed to the fact that they had successfully intercepted the localizer. The captain said, "Localizer is alive," and the first officer responded with, "Go down to 2,000, now can't we?" The captain answered with, "He didn't say go down." The captain decided to check with the controller to see everything was ready for them to perform the ILS landing. The captain asked, "Is 723 cleared for the ILS?" The controller let the captain know that they indeed were ready to go down. The pilots then took the DC-9 into the mushy weather below them. As the jet passed the outer marker, the first officer called for the before landing checklist. As they ticked off items on that list, the plane dropped through the thick clouds surrounding Boston. But in the cockpit, it seemed like things were starting to unravel. The pilot seemed to have a problem with one of the instruments in their cockpit. Someone in the cockpit said, "Okay, just fly the plane." And the other person replied with, "You better go raw data, I don't trust that thing." In the midst of all of this, the captain radioed to the controller in Boston that Flight 723 was on final, and the controller issued the final clearance by saying, "Cleared to land 4 right, traffic's clearing at the end, the RVR shows more than 6,000, a fog bank is moving in pretty heavy across the approach end," end quote. The pilots acknowledged their landing clearance. Unknown to the controller, this was the last time that he would hear from Flight 723. In the cockpit, the crew had their hands full with whatever was going wrong in their cockpit. The captain was like, "Let's just get back on course," and the first officer said, "I just gotta get this back." From the cockpit, the captain said something, which was then immediately followed up by a shout, presumably because a seawall might have appeared right in front of the windows. But it was too little, too late for the pilots to do anything. The DC-9 crashed into a seawall that was 165 feet to the right of the extended runway centerline of runway 4 right. The crash site was about 3,000 feet short of the runway's displaced threshold. Initially, 2 people survived the crash, but their injuries were too severe, meaning that in the end, no one survived. The jet had crashed into the seawall of the Boston Harbor main ship channel, and the wreck of the plane had spilled onto the runway. The wreck immediately gave investigators some clues about what didn't bring the plane down. The control cables, although severed, were in good shape, and they were attached to the control surface of the plane and the control column, meaning that the pilots would not have had a hard time controlling the plane on its way down. The flaps were also found to be extended, and there was no sign of an in-flight structural failure. All of Flight 723 was right there at the crash site. The engines also showed telltale signs of damage, which showed that they were working right when the plane impacted the ground. Something that the investigators wanted to know was the information that was being fed to the pilots, specifically the altimeter information. But as it turned out, the instruments were too damaged for the investigators to get any readings from. The captain's altimeter showed 660 feet at the time of impact, but the investigators quickly figured out that this was due to impact forces and not due to the altimeter being broken. So that begs the question, why did this plane go below the glide slope? The reason why starts before the plane even started its descent down to the runway. As Flight 723 was getting close to the localizer, the controller was busy with another plane that had just been handed off to him. But this plane was in conflict with another plane that was at the exact same altitude, and most of the controller's attention was directed towards the traffic conflict. So here's the problem. When the controller should have been clearing Flight 723 down to land, he was busy with this conflict, and rightly so. The man was trying to prevent a mid-air collision. But this meant that the final clearance for Flight 723 was delayed. This meant that the crew overshot the interception point of the localizer of the runway. This was made worse by the fact that the plane arrived over the outer marker 46 knots above the maximum speed that was allowed. So the delayed clearance was now having ripple effects on the rest of the flight. All of this meant that the landing was now made so much harder for the pilots. All of this now put the plane above the glide slope, and the pilots would have to put the plane into a faster than usual descent for them to capture the glide slope. As if all of this wasn't enough, the pilots had something else working against them. The flight director. The flight director basically tells you how to fly the plane. It's a bunch of lines across the artificial horizon. The flight director has a few modes of operation. In the VOR/LOC mode, you follow the roll command bar, meaning that this mode will help you intercept the localizer. But the thing is, in the VOR/LOC mode, when you intercept the glide slope, the plane must be on or below the localizer. If the plane is too high, the pilot will not have pitch guidance, meaning that the quality of data given by the flight director is degraded significantly. But you can make an interception from above, but you'd have to use the approach mode. The flight path of the plane showed exactly this. The plane was well above the glide slope and it was struggling to latch onto the correct glide path. So now, the plane is too fast. It overshot the interception point, and since the flight director is configured incorrectly, the pilots do not have a good idea about what their plane is doing because they're not being fed the full picture by their instruments. The comments made by the crew threw a lot of light on what was happening in the cockpit. When the plane first deviated away from the localizer, the captain was heard saying, "Get on it, Joe." They then realized that the flight director was unreliable. This is when the investigators made a shocking discovery. The flight director was in the go-around mode. This meant that the crew had set it to the wrong mode, which caused even more confusion on the flight deck. So, why did they do this? They knew that the flight director was giving them incorrect information. This is why the captain asked the first officer to go to raw data. Well, the pilots first cut their teeth on the DC-9 with the Collins flight director. On those models, a full clockwise rotation would set the flight director to the approach mode. But on the plane that they were flying, doing that would put the flight director into the go-around mode. We aren't sure if this is what happened, but this is a good hypothesis nonetheless. But sealing their fate was the captain not doing callouts. You see, in non-visual conditions, the pilots not flying should be calling out the altitude like 200 above and 100 above. But in this case, the captain did not do that. Maybe, had the captain done that, then they might have realized that they were in trouble. This accident is a perfect example of how non-critical problems can come together to cause a massive crash. In this case, the vectors to intercept the localizer were not as per standard. causing the plane to overshoot. The approach clearance was given late, further destabilizing the plane. The first officer, who was being fed imprecise data by the flight director, was preoccupied with that, and the captain was in contact with the controllers, and he was worried about the weather. In the midst of all of this, Flight 723 slipped below the glide slope, and unfortunately, no one noticed. If you want to watch a video similar to this one, I highly recommend that you watch my video on Delta Airlines Flight 554. I promise you'll love it. Thank you for watching this episode of Mini Air Crash Investigation. If you like the videos that I make, do consider liking and subscribing. It will really help the channel grow. I will catch you guys next time. Stay safe.